As Zoya moved through her days, she started noticing just how much silence shaped her world. It wasn't just about the secrets she kept, but also about what other people saw in her quietness. To some, she was wise. To others, she seemed distant or aloof. A few even thought her silence meant she didn't care. And in a way, none of them were completely wrong, but none of them were truly right either. You see, silence is like a blank canvas. It invites people to paint their own picture. When someone doesn't share much about themselves, others tend to fill in the gaps with their own ideas and assumptions. Zoya had lived inside these assumptions for years. They acted as a shield, protecting her from prying questions, but they also trapped her in an identity she never really chose for herself. There were so many moments when she desperately wanted to speak up, to correct them and say, "That's not who I am inside." But to correct them, she would have to explain. And to explain, she would have to be vulnerable. And vulnerability? That scared her more than any misunderstanding ever could. Her secrets were layered, like an onion. Some were ghosts from the past. Times she wanted something with all her heart but pretended she didn't. Others were ongoing battles, needs she still denied herself because admitting to them felt selfish. She had taught herself to choose emotional stability over emotional honesty. Psychologically, this is called avoidance coping. It's a strategy that helps you feel better in the short term, but it quietly builds up a massive amount of emotional strain over the long run. And Zoya felt that strain, physically. Her shoulders were always tight, like they were carrying an invisible weight. Sleep was a restless visitor, arriving late and leaving early. She often felt exhausted, even on days when she had done nothing at all. These weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of containment. Holding back emotions takes energy. Suppressing your true desires takes effort. When silence goes on for too long, it becomes hard labor. One afternoon, she ran into an old acquaintance. They had a brief, polite chat. As they were about to part ways, the woman said, "You know, you're exactly the same." Zoya managed a smile, but inside, something clenched. Exactly the same didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a life sentence. The truth was, change had been happening inside her all along. It was just invisible to everyone else. That evening, Zoya opened her notebook again. As she wrote about that small encounter, she had a breakthrough. Her silence had kept her safe from conflict, yes, but it had also kept her from being truly seen. People can't celebrate the growth they were never invited to witness. This realization brought a new kind of sadness, not for what she had lost, but for all the things she had never allowed to even begin. Psychological growth often starts with discomfort. When you start questioning the coping mechanisms you've relied on for years, your mind fights back. For Zoya, that resistance showed up as doubt. She worried, if I start speaking up, will people think I'm needy? If I show my emotions, will I overwhelm them? If I'm finally honest, will I lose the stability I've worked so hard to build? But she was starting to see that stability without authenticity felt empty. It felt hollow. So she started to experiment. Not with dramatic confessions or big emotional outbursts, just with small, quiet truths. When someone asked how she was, she'd admit she was tired instead of just saying, "I'm fine." She started expressing her preferences instead of automatically letting others decide. And with each tiny act of honesty, she waited for the disaster she was sure would follow. But nothing catastrophic happened. This genuinely surprised her. Her nervous system had been trained for years to expect rejection. Yet, in reality, people responded with simple neutrality, or sometimes, even with warmth. This completely challenged the story she had told herself for decades. The story that her needs were too much for others to handle. Of course, some secrets remained private, and she learned to be okay with that. Not every truth needs to be shouted from the rooftops. But she also learned that some truths need to be acknowledged, just to yourself, to strip them of their power. Zoya was learning to tell the difference. Her silence didn't disappear. Instead, it softened. It transformed from a hiding place into a space for reflection. She still spoke less than most people, but when she did speak, her words had weight. They came from a place of being true to herself, not from a place of self-protection. The woman who had spent so long being emotionally invisible was slowly, carefully, returning to herself. Zoya finally understood that silence was never the enemy. Fear was. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being dismissed, the fear of being seen, really seen, and not being chosen. She was still a woman with many secrets. But those secrets no longer had a chokehold on her. They were a part of her, acknowledged and integrated, no longer demanding silence as their only hiding place. And in that quiet, personal evolution, Zoya found something incredibly rare. It wasn't a life without pain, but it was a life with self-respect. It wasn't a loud, flashy transformation, but a steady, quiet truth.